Ever since Insomniac's PS4 exclusive Spider-Man game was revealed at E3 2016, much like most PlayStation gamers, I have been stoked to get my hands on the game. Despite the fact I had never played one of their games before, the studio has certainly proved themselves to be a very capable developer over the years, being the creators of some of the industry's most recognisable franchises. But never before have they tackled an established and iconic IP like Spider-Man. It's been a long 2 years of waiting, and now after spending over 2 weeks with the title, and obtaining the Platinum Trophy, I can confidently say that Marvel's Spider-Man doesn't only stand up beside the long list of high caliber PlayStation 4 exclusives that have released this generation, but it is also the best superhero game I've ever played. If you own a PlayStation 4, this title is undoubtedly a worthy addition to your library. Now, the game certainly isn't flawless, but it did manage to greatly surprise me, namely with the story. As someone who enjoys Spider-Man's character, but is by no means an expert in the lore of the universe, I am genuinely surprised by just how much I enjoyed the story. It's probably the best Spider-Man narrative I've ever seen. While I always trusted the developer to create a somewhat compelling, if by the book, superhero tale, I never expected to care a great deal for the cast of characters, especially for Peter Parker himself, and even more specifically for his relationship with Mary Jane Watson, a character that is made to be infinitely more interesting than she ever has been in any film. Their overall dynamic is made compelling thanks to the game's fantastic writing, but I also grew to take great interest in Peter's already established relationship with almost all of the characters in the game, due to the stellar character models, facial animations, and voice performances across the board. As I'm sure you probably know, in this game Peter Parker has already been Spider-Man for 8 years, which greatly serves to its benefit. Because there is no origin story and no Uncle Ben this time around, thankfully, we get to witness Peter's dynamic with all of the game's characters, including many of the villains, in a new and unique light. Here, Spider-Man has already faced the majority of his famed rivals in some form, such as Rhino or Electro, and treading lightly in fear of spoiling anything, I really enjoyed the portrayal of certain other villains in the story. I can certainly understand why some players may feel certain twists in the plot were rather predictable and straightforward, but in my opinion the performances, animations, writing, and overall narrative execution was so good that the possibility of predictability being an issue didn't bother me in the slightest. All of the key story moments that are supposed to stand out and have significant weight during the plot absolutely do. Throughout the story there are some fantastic set pieces and grand boss battles to be found that were utterly terrific, and really assisted in elevating the main missions to create a campaign that rivals the very best the console has to offer. I guess this is the part where I should state the obvious. To no one's surprise, Spider-Man for the most part looks stunning graphically. Don't be fooled into believing the game received any kind of significant downgrade, as the detail in the environments is top notch. As a matter of fact, you can actually look into a large portion of windows on the map to see inside into individual rooms and apartments. Obviously Insomniac are using technical tricks to accomplish this that I by no means understand, but I found that level of detail impressive nonetheless. Not to mention the draw distance has to be close to the best I've ever seen. From a high vantage point you can practically see the entire map around you. However, I think the lighting tech on display goes such a long way in making Spider-Man look great that sometimes in the middle of the day when the night lights and beautiful sunset aren't present, the game can look pretty average. Not bad by any stretch, but at times it can just look on par with your average open world game. I've never had the pleasure of travelling to New York myself, but I found the developers' recreation of Manhattan to not only be detailed, but super fun to traverse and use as my own personal playground. The map itself isn't enormous, but rather super dense. There are a large amount of side activities that are added to your map as you progress through the story, and I have to say they are by far the aspect of the game I enjoyed the least. As we have come to expect from open world games that follow the typical Ubisoft formula, Spider-Man's activities include the likes of collectibles, locations, towers, enemy bases, and challenges. I really like the backpack collectibles. There are over 50 of them and they each provide a brief portion of backstory that essentially catches the player up on the past 8 years of Peter's life as Spider-Man. These, along with the real life and Marvel landmarks spread across the city, I liked so much that I completed them within my first few hours of gameplay. The content I take the most issue with are the of bases, randomly generated crimes, and challenges. These activities aren't that bad independently, but they just feel like generic filler content that grows incredibly repetitive to complete. The amount of random crimes needed to achieve 100% completion, for example, is absolutely absurd, with the player needing to complete approximately 160 of them. It's obvious that this is not the area where Insomniac devoted most of their attention to, which is totally fine, and I'm glad that they prioritize telling an intriguing and impactful story over creating super deep side content. Nonetheless, it is probably the weakest aspect of Spider-Man in my eyes, and it unfortunately did detract from my time with the game overall. Marvel's Spider-Man is at its absolute best when you are first getting adjusted to the excellent web-slinging mechanics. I've never played any other Spider-Man game in my life, but despite that, I honestly find it hard to believe that any better take on this aspect of gameplay has ever existed. Once the player has got the basics down, it becomes apparent Insomniac absolutely understands what swinging around a city as Spider-Man should feel like. And even though that phrase is kind of a meme at this point, the reason so many people say it is because it's so true. There is a perfect balance found between making the mechanics simple enough to understand and use on a basic level, while also taking a bit of time to fully master. From a gameplay perspective, it is certainly the aspect of the game that's the most fun. The combat has been compared to the Batman Arkham series ad nauseum, which I don't think is necessarily unwarranted, but even though the DNA of the core combo and counter-based brawling certainly comes from those games, that doesn't mean Spider-Man does nothing to distinguish itself. Spider-Man as a character is naturally incredibly agile and stylish, which his fighting style reflects perfectly. When using your strikes, dodges, combos and finishes, the fantastic animations and intuitive controls make fighting crime super entertaining. An issue I do have with it, however, is that the player isn't always required to really use the wide array of combo moves available, since it is likely when playing on normal difficulty that you can get through most of the game just fine by dodging and mashing the attack button. It still adds a lot to the gameplay experience to chain together moves and take advantage of the unlockable combos, but it felt like a missed opportunity to not force the player to add a bit of variety to their playstyle when in certain situations or facing specific enemies. Speaking of enemies, I found the AI to be pretty solid. However, I do think some of the stronger enemy types have a little bit too much health. They often behave in a very similar manner to the weaker enemies in the game, with the only major distinction between the different categories being that you have to hit them 5 extra times, for example. Gameplay variety can be found in dedicated stealth missions where MJ and Miles Morales become playable. These sections have no combat involved whatsoever, so many find them to be rather dull compared to the fast-paced style found when playing as Spider-Man himself. But I thought these sections were an excellent way to change up the gameplay from time to time. They never overstay their welcome and are brief enough that they don't grow repetitive. Every time I thought to myself, oh okay, I've had enough of this now, the mission would come to a close. Insomniac were by no means designing an incredible stealth game. The mechanics and AI involved in these missions are incredibly simple and basic, but I nonetheless enjoyed these sections of the story for providing a bit of diversity. In regards to taking a stealthy approach as Spider-Man, the core mechanics get the job done and can be satisfying at times, but I just wish the developers had done more to allow the player to use stealth more often. For example, with the wave-based enemy camps you can take down across the map, stealth can be used only during the first wave. After that point you are automatically spotted by the reinforcements for no reason. I would have appreciated the option to complete those entire locations without being seen at all. There is so much Insomniac got right with Spider-Man. The score, and in particular the main theme, is epic. I love the customization on display. The large variety of unlockable suits add a lot to the player experience. Lots of them are really cool, while others are more on the wacky side. Each suit has a specific ability associated with it, however as long as the player has the corresponding suit unlocked, which can be done by completing activities all over New York, any ability can be used with any suit, which is a really neat idea that maximises the customization options available. The game's skill tree is for the most part actually interesting, providing me with new abilities that I wanted to have access to, and that were genuinely beneficial in a variety of scenarios. This is an area where the game succeeds far better than some other recent AAA releases. I typically dislike tacked on puzzles in games, but in this case they never really got in the way, and on the contrary acted to further emphasise how smart Peter is by highlighting his natural talents in science, which of course benefits the narrative as well. And even though I know how many gamers dislike them, I found the implementation of quick time events in gameplay to be a fun change of pace that added a lot to tense situations. I guess the easiest way to sum up the collective gameplay experience with Spider-Man is pure fun. Overall, I thoroughly enjoyed my time with Spider-Man PS4. I reached 100% completion, and outside of the repetitive and mostly uninspired open world activities, I had an absolute blast. It is quite unbelievable to me that exclusives for the PlayStation 4 have been so strong and of such high quality over the past few years, to the point where I'm unsure if a disappointing one is even possible at this point in time. Spider-Man absolutely upholds the high standard set by the likes of God of War and Horizon Zero Dawn, by being a must-own title for PlayStation fans. If you are a fan of the character, this is obviously a must-play, but even if you just appreciate open-world action games akin to other recent PlayStation exclusives and haven't yet picked up the superior superhero game, you should absolutely do so. This has been Sir Kaz, farewell.